I am vehemently opposed to veganism. I think that it is completely antithetical to human development and human survival.
Maybe the most common comment I get after I publish an episode is, what about scientists who vehemently disagree with scientists I just quoted?
Now, I know that when it comes to veganism, it's not scientific.
The last episode I made was called The Actual Cause of Type 2 Diabetes, and several of the comments went like this. From Tom Barrett, read the book The Big Fat Surprise and look into great scientists like Dr. Ben Bikman. I'm happy for you if you can lose some weight, but look for some alternative information. That's a good point. Although I have done an episode on Nina Teicholz, the author of The Big Fat Surprise, and I had watched an interview and a talk by Dr. Bikman while preparing the diabetes episode, I didn't fully understand him and I hadn't read his book. 10 lashes for me. Ugh. His book gets amazing reviews on Amazon. 85% are 5-star and only 1% are 1-star. The interview I watched was with Tom Bilyeu, who has 3 million subscribers, and that interview got 1.2 million views. The scientists I profiled get a small fraction of that. I have gotten emails for a long time from Mormons who say he is bucking Mormon teachings. Imagine being Hindu, Buddhist, or Seventh-day Adventist and promoting high meat consumption among faiths promoting vegetarianism. Mormon scripture calls for eating meat sparingly or not at all. He must have a lot of courage in his scientific convictions. But I do have Mormon friends in Utah who adore him because he endorses eating lots of meat and fat, which they love.
Humans can live a carnivore diet and live and thrive. Humans cannot live a purely plant-based diet. It is impossible.
I guess there's a lot of vegetarians in here. Yeah. They're in here. They're just too weak to raise their arms.
He recently published an opinion piece in a medical journal with the title, "Statin Therapy is Not Warranted for a Person with High LDL-cholesterol on a Low-Carbohydrate Diet." That essay caused my Twitter feed to explode among cardiologists and lipid scientists. So I thought, okay, Chris, he is an influential scientist willing to take controversial positions. Better show some respect and fully understand his positions and why they're so different from scientists that I've profiled. Maybe he has great insights on things we all need to hear. So join me on my journey of discovery into the mind of a contrarian scientist. As I walk along this beach, I have no idea what we'll learn. The first thing I want to do is revisit that interview with Tom Bilyeu that I didn't fully understand. It used emotional words in the title in all caps. Shocking science. When I saw those words, I got a pang of envy and dreamed of making an episode about the James Webb Telescope, because that is shocking. But if low-carb diets free us from the need of statins, that would be shocking too. Here's a clip from that interview with Tom.
And so that glucose sits around and then it gets converted eventually non-enzymatically. It's just this sort of process of the glucose changing into a molecule called sorbitol. And sorbitol is membrane impermeable. Once you have sorbitol in a cell, it literally can't go anywhere. And so you have more and more of this sorbitol accumulating in, say, the endothelial cells of blood vessels. And then these cells start pulling in more and more water, and then they burst.
I love understanding this stuff at the cellular level. And look, I'm so wildly ignorant. Like, it's crazy to me that I've gotten to my age without having heard any of what you're talking about right now.
I have a solid science background, but my impression is it takes a specialist in the field to fully understand complex biochemistry like that and fact check it. My concern is when someone throws out technical terms like that with such confidence, everyday people assume they're a real expert in the field. One of my core beliefs about nutrition science is the most reliable knowledge comes from human outcome data, not from debating about complex chemical reactions. I didn't hear much human outcome data in that interview. Lane Norton has a PhD in biochemistry, and here's what he had to say about that.
You can literally find a mechanism for anything to prove whatever you want, because mechanisms are only small parts of the story. The summation of all the mechanisms shows up as human outcome data.
So I approached Ben's book with a sense of dread, thinking, oh no, a lot of conclusions from controversial biochemistry, but I was relieved to find out that it's an easy read, clearly written, and thoroughly referenced. The references are important to me because I thoroughly chase them. You can tell immediately why it's so popular because it ties one simple cause, what Dr. Bikman calls a humble hormone, insulin, to a whole array of health outcomes. Heart health, the brain, reproductive health, cancer, aging, the skin, muscles and bones, stomach and kidney, the metabolic syndrome and obesity. I have to admit I was shaken by the endorsements of the book. Would you expect a great scientist to have endorsements from great scientists? One he references in the book, like Christopher Gardner of Stanford, who has an impeccable reputation? One endorsement was from Nina Teicholz, who lobbies for the beef industry and is regarded by nutrition scientists I know as a bad actor who runs a front group. I've done episodes about Rob Wolf and his regenerative agriculture ideas, and my conclusion is he let the beef industry greenwash himself out of his senses, to use Greta Thunberg's term. I don't know any climate scientist who agrees with Rob's ideas about regenerative agriculture. All three authors call for high-meat diets. All three have things to say about vegans.
The folks that are advocating this kind of vegan life way, this vegan-centric model, it's all sound bites, elevator pitches, moral superiority.
One group are the vegans, and for the most part, what I would suggest is just ignore them. It's like talking to a cow because they're mindless drones. And, they've been basically brainwashed to believe some really, really poor evidence in science. They'll lie, they'll cheat, they'll do whatever they can to get across their religious dogmas.
I don't know any credible scientists who talk like that, but I guess it racks up the social media views. Are you missing my pretty face? I guess you'd rather see that. One of the first points Ben makes in his book is shared widely among diabetes scientists, and that is that insulin predicts diabetes long before blood glucose levels do. He says historically we've relied on blood glucose tests because they're cheap and easy to do. And he says that's a shame because if we had only known our insulin levels were high, it would have prevented a lot of diabetes cases. He points out the test for insulin is now much cheaper and easier, but still isn't available everywhere. Here's why testing for insulin is a much better early indicator of diabetes than testing for glucose is. This will be my biochemical lecture on mechanisms. What? As the patient goes down the path of diabetes, his cells say, we're not feeling so good here. We're gonna pass on some of that glucose in the blood. And the pancreas, alarmed, says, hey cells, this idiot is chugging a whole liter of Coke. Mayday, mayday. You're supposed to act when I tell you to pull up more glucose. Here, have more insulin so you can't miss the urgency of this idiot's Coke in the house. Can you hear me now? And the cells respond, dude, quit drowning us in insulin. We can't take it anymore. From now on, we resist your insulin. And thanks to Dr. Taylor's MRI machine, we now know what happens next.
There is a really wasted, raggy pancreas.
That's somebody with type 2 diabetes?
With type 2 diabetes.
The pancreas goes, I'm dying, literally, I'm shriveling up, and I can't put out insulin fast enough anymore. And as the cells resist insulin, blood glucose finally begins to rise, and we have a 4-alarm fire. Next time you see your doctor, she drops the bomb. Oh, you got diabetes. Sucks to be you. Maybe back off on the Coke and the double cheeseburgers? Here, I'll prescribe some insulin to make up for your dying pancreas. Okay, my lecture was oversimplified. The liver plays a critical role too, and it got fatty and stopped working as well also. Whatever, I think Dr. Bikman and mainstream diabetes scientists like Dr. Roy Taylor, who I profiled in the last episode on the cause of diabetes, would say that was basically correct. So how do they come to basically opposite conclusions about the solution? One key is Dr. Taylor believes weight gain causes insulin resistance, and Dr. Bikman believes it could be the opposite. Here's what he wrote in his book.
Many of these studies report that insulin sensitivity improves because of weight loss, but as I suggested, it's not that simple. In looking at the data from these same studies, it is just as viable to conclude that weight loss occurred because of improved insulin sensitivity, not the other way around. And indeed, some studies do acknowledge a possibility that insulin resistance may come before the subject's weight gain, or insulin sensitivity may precede their weight loss.
The first paper he referenced was a somewhat obscure paper from 1998, Weight History, Glucose Intolerance, and Insulin Levels in Middle-Aged Swedish Men. It only has 58 citations, but the author, Sophia Carlson, caught my attention because she's a respected diabetes researcher with some fascinating recent papers. This was one of her first papers at the start of her career. I struggled with that paper. Here's what it says. The results of this study indicate that overweight decreases glucose tolerance and that this relation depends on duration as well as magnitude of obesity. In other words, the longer we're overweight, the less glucose tolerance. Weight gain occurs and glucose intolerance follows. She used the term glucose tolerance because it includes both insulin resistance and the pancreas's inability to produce more insulin. At a European Diabetes Association annual meeting, one of her recent papers made a splash, and so they interviewed her.
We looked at the risk of developing type 2 diabetes across all occupations in the entire Swedish population, and what we see is that in some occupations there is a 3-fold increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared to others. So that would be cleaners, professional drivers, and manufacturing workers. So what we see is that the future professional drivers, they are almost 3 times as likely to be overweight already at the age of 18.
Now, a lot of cleaners would say to you, hang on, Sophia, I'm a cleaner, I do a lot of physical activity.
Yeah, but then it's the weight that needs to be targeted. A healthier diet, try to reduce the fat, increase the vegetables and fruit.
Does that sound like the kind of scientist you want to reference to support your high-meat, low-carb diet? I wonder if Sophia knows her paper was referenced in support of that. I just spent 2 weeks in Sweden where Sophia lives, and I was fascinated by their dietary recommendations and the rates of diabetes. Their diabetes rates are roughly half of ours here in America, and their obesity rate is about 21%, whereas here in America we're at 36%. Their average lifespan is over 4 years higher than ours. Americans consume 124 kilograms of meat per capita, and Sweden consumes about 77. Fast food is making some slow progress in Sweden. They have 12 KFC outlets now, but that compares to 909 in the UK, where they have a 28% obesity rate. My impression was real food is still available everywhere in Sweden, and they actually eat it. For example, I took this photo of spicy tofu and avocado on seeded rye at a Subway kiosk and saw food like that everywhere we went. I've read that low carb is slowly gaining some traction in Sweden like KFCs are, much to the dismay of their National Food Agency, whose scientists are opposed. But mostly what I saw were vegan and vegetarian options at a higher rate than in America. But I didn't see all the low carb options we have. But if you're a Swede and you want ultra-processed American food high in saturated fat and low in carbs, Dr. Bikman has a side hustle selling meal replacement shakes that you can order online. You may be wondering why an apple is in the product shot when in his book, apples are on his list of many fruits to avoid. It's because they're in the form of powdered apple cider vinegar. Dr. Bikman cited 4 more studies like Sophia's, but they were also more than 20 years old, and we've had a lot of expensive studies on obesity versus insulin since then.
Let's just look at the human outcome data, because we have trials where they equate calories and protein and vary the amount of carbohydrate and fat, and very conclusively show that there's no difference in fat loss or fat gain from overfeeding or underfeeding carbohydrate versus fat.
So then Dr. Bikman switched from insulin's role in obesity to what dietary pattern affects insulin resistance the most, a critical topic. He then referenced this study, weight loss with a low-fat, Mediterranean, or low-carb diet. However, he used the words moderate fat diet instead of Mediterranean.
For 2 years, study subjects were assigned one of 3 diets: a calorie-restricted, low-fat diet, a calorie-restricted, moderate fat diet, and a non-calorie-restricted, low-carb diet.
The low-fat diet was actually 30% fat, and the Mediterranean was 35%. Not a big difference. But as we'll see, those 2 diets produced very different results, probably not from the 5% difference in fat. That study also caught my attention because Shai, the lead author, has a great reputation. The low-fat diet was based on the American Heart Association's year 2000 guidelines, which ironically cautioned against too low a fat intake. Food guidelines are so politicized in the US, I had trouble understanding what exactly the subjects were eating on that diet in this study because the wording is vague. Lean meat and low-fat dairy was on the menu, whatever those actually mean in practice. The Mediterranean diet was much clearer. They replaced most of the red meat and lamb with fish and poultry. Much of the fat came from olive oil and nuts. It was based on the Harvard food pyramid. The low-carb diet was based on Atkins, which makes sense because they partly funded the study. My guess is the Atkins Foundation wanted to show you don't need to restrict calories on their diet. Here's how the weight loss went. It followed the typical pattern the scientists in my last episode described. Great short-term results for low carb, but then the Mediterranean diet closed in, and after 2 years, it was close. Dr. Bikman said this about the results.
In addition to causing the greatest weight loss, the unrestricted low-carb diet also helped lower insulin and improve insulin resistance the most.
But for diabetic participants, which were the most interesting to me, that was clearly not the case. Here are the charts. The Mediterranean diet is in orange and low carb is in blue. For fasting glucose among non-diabetics, there was no difference between the diets. No surprise, a non-diabetic body is good at controlling glucose. But for diabetics, there was a vast difference. The low-carb diet performed well for 12 months, but a large gap opened between low-carb and Mediterranean at 24 months. I wasn't surprised about fasting insulin either. But for diabetics, where it's really important, the Mediterranean diet performed best. And for insulin resistance, it was far better on the Mediterranean diet than on low-carb. Not how Dr. Bikman represented it. Here's the thing, low-carb diets have a reputation for being very effective in the short term, about equal to other diets in the medium term, which this study showed, but having trouble in the long term with both weight and health markers. This study only had a 2-year duration, but lucky for us, Dr. Shai did a 4-year follow-up to this study, something Dr. Bikman didn't mention. After the 2-year trial ended, the study organizers were able to keep contact info for 80% of the original group of 329 people. With all restrictions lifted, they wondered what would happen to them over a longer time horizon with no one watching. And what they found is 4 years after the study ended, 67% of them had kept eating as they had become used to during the trial. So they were able to do a 4-year follow-up of those 67%. This is what some of those charts look like. The low-carb group gained back more than half the weight they lost. The Mediterranean group gained back some, but not as much, and over a 6-year period was now the best of the diets for weight loss. It also appeared to be better for blood lipids. After 20 years of these studies and collaborating with Harvard, she determined that the Mediterranean diet beats all the others, including low carb.
So Irish Shai, thank you so much, Dr. Shai. So you did some of the seminal work with Mediterranean diet.
We learned that indeed Mediterranean diet was always superior on either low-carb diet or low-fat diet. We all know that olive oil and the whole grains and fruits and vegetables are healthy, but we don't know really why. So we asked ourselves, what is the common denominator? And one of the conclusions was that maybe polyphenols, you know what are polyphenols? They are secondary metabolites that are produced only by plants.
So she focused her research on what makes it so healthy and came up with the green Mediterranean diet. This is how she describes it.
So in the Direct Plus trial, which was our last trial among hundreds of participants over years, we asked ourselves what happens if we double the polyphenols, and this is the green Mediterranean diet.
What would a meal look like if you're doubling the polyphenols?
I'll link articles in the description about how they doubled the polyphenols, but it was simple. They went with more vegetables and less meat than the regular Mediterranean diet. They made sure the nuts were walnuts, which have the highest polyphenols of all the nuts. And they enriched it with green items, including 3 to 4 cups of green tea per day and 100 grams of a mankai green shake. Mankai is otherwise known as water lentils or duckweed. It's a small aquatic plant that's been consumed in Asia for thousands of years, that's rich in polyphenols and has other things like being a good source of bioavailable B12, even though it's a plant. There is a social media theory from people like Paul Saladino that vegetables contain defense mechanisms to keep us from eating them, and so they harm us. Here's what Dr. Shai believes.
What are polyphenols? Are secondary metabolites that plants produce when they are under stress, like pathogens, UV, pH, some other stressors that we also as humans actually experience. And this is like their COVID-19 vaccination that they take and produce for themselves. This is how we do have to think. The polyphenols, like antioxidants, we don't understand all the mechanisms behind those 8,000 kinds of polyphenols. Maybe it's quite potent, much more than we thought.
Her studies on the green Mediterranean diet were very sophisticated because they used MRI scanners to image the brain, and they measured liver fattiness. And they took and froze gut microbiome samples. The green Mediterranean diet was twice as potent as the regular Mediterranean diet at reducing liver fat over 2 years in the 300 middle-aged overweight men in her study. And we know liver fat is no bueno. The green Mediterranean diet was also more potent in preventing brain degeneration. I don't like saying this at all, but didn't Dr. Bikman misrepresent Dr. Shai's study and then neglect to mention that she had a 4-year follow-up to the study? Ben's book has a lot of references, and we could turn this into a 12-hour episode by talking about the others that I chased. But I think you get the idea, and it's kind of soul-destroying, no? Chasing references for this book reminded me of chasing them for The Big Fat Surprise and Gary Taubes' books, which I did for previous episodes. They also picked somewhat obscure references and misrepresented them, but they seem to have clear monetary motivations. I could imagine some rogue doctors doing this like Mark Hyman and Ken Berry do, but I never imagined it would happen at a respected university. Ben does recommend the books of Nina and Gary to his readers. Which brought me to a fascinating question. How does a scientist like Dr. Bikman arrive at a completely opposite solution to other scientists and be so sure of himself? Is it really that he's focused on cell biochemistry and scientists like Dr. Carlson and Dr. Shai are focused on human outcome data? He did rely on his cell biologist background to answer a question about the ethics of eating meat.
And to speak completely as a scientist, and a life scientist at that, a cell biologist. Everything that is living because it benefits from something that died. I say that because perhaps the moral vegan is going to say, well, I'm not going to eat animal foods because I don't want to contribute to killing that animal. That is wrong thinking, because everything that we eat is something that was alive and we've killed it. Even growing plants, we are alive because we're benefiting from something that died, plant or animal.
I think a lot of people who aren't biologists would say, wait, isn't eating a pig different than eating an apple? Yes, that apple had to die, but not the tree that it came from. And didn't the tree grow that apple in hopes that we would eat it? But I came across a passage in the book that stopped me in my tracks and does shed a lot of light about how two scientists can arrive at such different conclusions.
Multiple epidemiological studies, that is, studies that get data from questionnaires, find a correlation between fiber consumption and improved insulin sensitivity. Results from clinical trials are mixed. Interpreting the results requires some scrutiny in the context of insulin resistance. Because clinical trials, not questionnaires, help establish cause and effect, we'll only focus on those.
Honestly, that passage shocked me to my toes. For one thing, many landmark epidemiological studies, like the 50-year 7-country study that made the Mediterranean diet so popular, didn't rely on questionnaires. It relied on assaying the food of what the subjects actually ate, taking blood samples and vital signs.
Dr. Carlotti of Paris preparing a patient for the electrocardiogram, which is being taken by Professor Kimura of Japan.
Dr. Fidanza showing a blood sample that's clear and a blood sample that's creamy.
He never referenced that study or the dozens of scientists involved who published over 700 papers and 10 books about it. Epidemiologists do have access to reliable long-term data that doesn't involve questionnaires, as Dr. Carlson has.
So for the men, we had information from the military conscription, which is something that all men in Sweden did when they were 18. And we also see in the women, because we had information from the medical birth registry, so at the time of the first pregnancy, first trimester.
The trouble with throwing out a whole branch of science like epidemiology and focusing on clinical trials as Dr. Bikman does is it narrows your time window from a few months to a few years. And the problem with that is diseases like cancer, heart disease, and kidney disease are usually on multi-decade timelines. Should we go find some turtles? And that is how a Dr. Carlson and a Dr. Shai can come to very different conclusions from a Dr. Bikman, because they're looking at both long and short-term studies, and he's only looking short-term. When I posted the episode on the cause of type 2 diabetes, it got 700 comments in a hurry, and maybe half of them were passionate defenses of low-carb diets. I tried to make sense of what they had in common. Were they understandably influenced by Dr. Bikman's emphatic confidence, by other influencers, by papers they had read? But there seemed to be one thing that united them all. They were all relatively short-term. There were dozens of testimonials, but they were from months to a few years. Low-carb diets have been enormously popular forever, and I followed them in America for at least 150 years, from Banning and Salisbury to Atkins and keto. What they all have in common is great short-term results, moderate results for a year or two, like other diets, but they fall far short of the Mediterranean diet in long-term health outcomes. The thing is, meat and saturated fat have a dose-response relationship. You can eat a little and be healthy all your life. You can eat a lot and be healthy in the short term, but most people can't eat a lot and be healthy in the long term. And that brings me to the original topic of this video, Dr. Bikman's claim that vegan diets are impossible. He has a point. Lacto-vegetarians have been around for millennia in the form of Hindus and Buddhists, but vegans have been around for maybe 70-ish years? One thing we do have is data from scientists like Dr. Shai in her collaboration with Harvard to modify the Mediterranean diet to make it ever more plant-dominant and demonstrably healthier. And we do have some rigorous trials on the order of 20 years that compare veganism to other long-lived diets, and it is the equal or better of all of them, with the possible exception of pesco-vegetarian, where people eat fish once or twice a week. Some of those studies are from the Seventh-day Adventists, and that brings up a question I've had about Dr. Bikman for years. How does he reconcile two great American religions founded in the 1800s with very similar health codes, Mormons and Adventists, both of whom had epidemiologists publish papers about them, reporting they lived much longer than other Americans? Dr. Bikman must know there's a very high percentage of vegetarians vegetarians and vegans among Adventists, and the news about them in recent decades is that they have become the longest-lived population on Earth, with BMIs and rates of diabetes which makes even Sweden look bad. The news in recent decades about Mormons has become less rosy, because research out of BYU has observed their BMIs have risen above American averages. One difference between the health codes of the two religions is Adventist co-founder Ellen White would say, "Not an ounce of flesh meat should enter our stomachs." Mormon scripture opens the door a crack. Meat should be eaten sparingly. Until the last few decades, church leaders used to emphasize that, and it was even in a popular church hymn. Mormons refer to those scriptures as the word of wisdom.
When I was a young boy, we used to sing a hymn in Sunday school titled, "In Our Lovely Deseret." We called it the Word of Wisdom song, but it was one of our favorite hymns. Part of one of the verses reads, "That the children may live long and be beautiful and strong, drink no liquor, and they eat but a very little meat." We seldom had a conference in those days without a talk about the word of wisdom.
So what does Dr. Bikman say when he's speaking to other Mormons about the word of wisdom?
Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are not spared from the plagues of prosperity, these chronic diseases that stem from insulin resistance. In fact, evidence suggests we may suffer from them more than members of other religions. Our struggle with poor metabolic health is even more surprising when we appreciate that we have specific revelation about health, the word of wisdom. But could our cultural interpretation of the word of wisdom partly explain why we are so prone to prominent insulin-related disorders? I believe so. We should be wary of well-intentioned voices that claim to promote a word of wisdom diet. There is no such thing. Prophets and apostles have divinely interpreted the application of the word of wisdom to include avoiding a short list of habit-forming substances, but they've not gone further, nor should we. This then leaves tremendous room for personal interpretation and application.
I think he just said the word sparingly can be interpreted broadly to mean a lot. So we've arrived at a place where Adventist nutrition researchers are highly respected among scientists, but almost unknown among consumers. And Dr. Bikman is very popular among consumers, but his reputation appears to be in trouble among scientists. The two groups have opposite takes on nearly identical health guidelines, but the Adventists have human outcome data to back them up. Dr. Bikman relies on a theory about insulin. So what are my conclusions about this fascinating journey of discovery we've been on? Number one, scientists like Roy Taylor and Ira Shai, who spend decades actually doing difficult science with a team of other scientists, don't have time to become popular on social media, and they don't have a popular message. Broccoli? Really? Number two, to become hugely popular on social media, you don't need to do science, but you do need to have a more popular message than to eat more vegetables and less meat. And number three, for reasons I'll never understand, Ben has aligned himself with social media stars and not scientists. And finally, every time I do a deep dive like this, not knowing what we'll discover, I'm amazed at how a simple 8-word line holds up so well. Eat real food, mostly plants, not too much. Thanks for watching, and thanks for putting up with me filming little segments as thoughts occur to me while I'm supposed to be on vacation with my wife.
So here we are on a beautiful Hawaiian vacation. And all of a sudden, we're hiking through a beautiful forest, and my husband has to stop and video. Then he has to run to catch up.